Hey family, welcome to Mr. Gray Family, where every story begins with us. Rain hammered against the windshield so hard it barely looked like Washington anymore. The traffic lights blurred red and yellow through the storm while Sarah gripped the steering wheel with both hands, trying to breathe through the sharp pain twisting through her stomach. Her chest rose unevenly. Another pain hit, harder this time. Oh God. Her voice cracked quietly. She pressed one trembling hand beneath her belly while the other searched blindly for her phone the passenger seat. But her fingers felt weak. Everything felt weak. Outside, horns blasted somewhere behind her. The light had already turned green. Sarah couldn't move. Rain slammed against the glass in violent waves while fear slowly crawled into her throat. Not now. Please not now. Her breathing became shaky. A sudden cramp ripped through her body again. And this time she gasped loud enough to scare herself. The phone slipped from her lap. That was when headlights stopped behind her car. A door opened. Somebody ran through the storm toward her. A few seconds later, the driver's side door jerked open violently, cold rain blowing inside the car. Brian crouched beside her instantly. Look at me. Sarah tried speaking, but her voice barely came out. Brian's expression changed immediately when he saw tears sliding down her face. Sarah? Her hand tightened against her stomach. I think, she whispered painfully, something's wrong with the baby. For 1 second, the world felt terrifyingly quiet. Not outside, inside, the kind of silence people feel right before panic takes over. But Brian didn't panic. His voice stayed calm even while rain soaked his coat completely. You're okay. I've got you. Another sharp pain hit her. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut. Brian immediately reached inside the car carefully. Hey, stay with me, all right? Look at me. She tried. God, she tried. But fear was already taking over her body. Because 3 months earlier, Sarah thought she had everything. A luxury condo near Capitol Riverfront. A powerful husband the entire city admired. A baby on the way. From the outside, her marriage looked perfect. But lonely marriages always look beautiful in public. That was the dangerous part. And the man who was supposed to protect her, the man who promised to love her, he had already walked away. The rain poured harder while Brian carefully helped her out of the car. Sarah nearly collapsed from the pain, but his arm caught her immediately. I've got you, he repeated softly. And strangely, those 3 words hurt almost as much as the contractions, because her own husband hadn't said anything comforting to her in months. Brian opened the SUV door quickly and helped her inside while thunder shook somewhere above the city. Then, a sharp cut forward, hospital lights, fast footsteps, machines beeping. Michael stepping through the emergency room doors looking completely frozen, his expensive coat still damp from the rain, his breathing uneven now for the first time in years. Then he saw them. Brian standing beside Sarah's hospital bed, one hand resting protectively near her shoulder, and Sarah holding onto Brian's hand instead of his. Michael stopped walking. The doctor standing nearby looked directly at him. Stress from abandonment nearly cost her the baby. The sentence hit like a punch. Michael's face lost all color. For a moment, nobody moved. Brian slowly lifted his eyes toward him. Cold, controlled, protective, not angry. That somehow made it worse, because Michael suddenly realized another man had shown up for his wife while he was too busy protecting meetings, investors, and his own ego. And standing there inside that hospital room, for the first time in his life, Michael looked like a man finally understanding what failure actually felt like. Welcome to Mr. Gray Family. A storytelling universe built for people who crave meaning, emotion, and unforgettable narratives. Here, every story begins with a spark, and ends with a feeling you'll carry long after the video ends. Love, betrayal, family, secrets, lessons, it's all here, wrapped in immersive narration that makes you forget everything else. If you're searching for stories that pull your heart, challenge your mind, and keep you coming back, subscribe now. Your story begins the moment you choose to stay. Her billionaire husband abandoned her during pregnancy, but the man who hated him the most became the one who saved her life. And honestly, that wasn't even the part that destroyed everybody involved. Have you ever loved somebody who slowly stopped loving you back while pretending everything was fine? Have you ever sat beside somebody at dinner, slept beside them at night, smiled beside them in public, while quietly feeling them disappear from you piece by piece? Because carrying a man's child while feeling emotionally abandoned inside your own marriage is something to a person, especially when the whole world thinks you're living a perfect life. And what happened after that stormy night in Washington, D.C. changed all 3 of them forever. One man lost control of everything he thought money could protect. One woman stopped begging to be chosen, and one rival stepped into a situation that was never supposed to become personal. So before we begin, if you believe nobody deserves abandonment during pregnancy, comment protector below. And if you love emotional stories filled with real tension, powerful lessons, messy relationships, unforgettable endings, take a second to subscribe to Mr. Gray Family, because this story, it only gets heavier from here. Washington, D.C. had a way of making powerful people feel untouchable. Every morning before sunrise, black SUVs rolled through downtown streets while government workers rushed into buildings carrying coffee cups and exhaustion. Expensive restaurants filled up before noon with politicians pretending not to recognize lobbyists. Men in tailored suits talked loudly about contracts over whiskey, while women in heels walked through hotel lobbies looking permanently late for something important. The city never truly rested. It only paused long enough to calculate its next move. Sarah used to love that energy. From the outside, her life looked exactly like the kind of story people envied online. Luxury condo near Capitol Riverfront. Designer dresses hanging inside walk-in closets, private events in Georgetown, vacation photos people secretly zoomed into out of jealousy. And beside her in nearly every picture stood Michael, tall, sharp, controlled, the kind of man who looked expensive without trying. Even his silence carried confidence. At 37, Michael had already built one of the fastest-growing tech companies in Washington. Business magazines called him DC's youngest elite disruptor. Investors chased him constantly. Politicians invited him to private dinners. People listened carefully whenever he spoke. But Sarah remembered the version of him before all that attention hardened him. That was the version she fell in love with. They met 3 years earlier at a charity gala in Georgetown. Sarah almost hadn't attended that event at all. Her friend practically dragged her there after work. "You need to stop acting married before somebody actually marries you," her friend teased while fixing Sarah's earrings in the car mirror. Sarah laughed. "I just wanted food and sleep. Well, tonight you're getting rich people and tiny appetizers." And honestly, that sounded accurate. The ballroom overflowed with old money and polished smiles. Waiters carried champagne through crowds of people discussing business mergers like they were discussing weather. Sarah stood near the dessert table quietly adjusting the strap of her heel beneath her dress when a voice beside her said, "You look like you regret coming here already." She looked up. Michael stood there holding 2 champagne glasses. Perfect posture. Relaxed smile. Too confident. Sarah raised an eyebrow immediately. "And you look like you practiced that line in the mirror." Michael grinned. "Only twice." That made her laugh faster than she expected. And for some reason Michael looked genuinely proud of himself afterward. That was the dangerous thing about him back then. He knew how to make people feel chosen. The conversation flowed naturally after that. Not forced, not performative. Real. Michael asked questions and actually listened to the answers. Sarah teased him for sounding too polished. Michael teased her for openly judging everybody at the gala. "You're staring at people like you're reviewing them for a documentary," he told her, "because half these people look emotionally exhausting." Michael nearly choked laughing. By the end of the night, they sat together near the balcony overlooking Georgetown streets while the party slowly faded behind them. And somewhere during that conversation, Sarah noticed something rare. Michael became softer whenever he forgot to impress people. That version of him felt honest. The relationship moved quickly after that. Michael loved Sarah's warmth immediately. She came from Southeast D.C., where family gatherings lasted all night and conversations happened loudly over music and food. People interrupted each other constantly. Cousins argued over card games like professional athletes. Nobody left hungry. Michael's world felt completely different. Quiet dinners, private schools, golf conversations, controlled emotions. The first time Sarah attended dinner with Michael's family in Virginia, she nearly laughed halfway through the meal because everybody spoke so calmly. Finally, she leaned toward Michael and whispered, "The way your family whispers during dinner is terrifying." Michael tried not to laugh. "The way your cousins scream over dominoes is terrifying." That's called love. And honestly, back then those differences made the relationship exciting. Michael admired how emotionally alive Sarah's world felt. Sarah admired how safe Michael seemed. For the first year, they balanced each other beautifully. Saturday mornings usually meant coffee walks near the waterfront. Michael hated crowded grocery stores, but Sarah forced him to go anyway because she claimed rich people needed regular human experiences. One afternoon, she caught him staring at organic tomatoes with complete confusion. Why are they so expensive? Michael asked seriously. Sarah looked horrified. You grew up rich and still complain about tomato prices? I believe in financial accountability. You drove here in a car worth somebody's student loans. Michael laughed so hard people turned around to stare. Moments like that made loving him easy. At night they danced in the kitchen while old R&B played softly through the condo speakers. Sarah cooked while Michael pretended he was helping even though he mostly stole food from the pan. Sometimes he wrapped both arms around her waist while she cooked and rested his chin against her shoulder quietly. No phone, no meetings, no pressure, just them. And for a while Sarah truly believed that version of Michael would last forever. But success changes people slowly, not overnight. First it changes their schedule, then their priorities, then eventually, the way they love people. Sarah noticed the first crack one Thursday night. Dinner sat untouched on the kitchen island while rain tapped softly against the condo windows. Michael sat across from her scrolling through emails during the entire meal. Sarah watched him carefully. You know you've answered work emails for the last 20 minutes straight? Michael barely looked up. Big investor meeting tomorrow. She smiled lightly at first. Okay, but your food's getting cold. Mm-hmm. That was all he said. Sarah looked down quietly at her plate, and for the first time since marrying him, she felt alone sitting right beside him. That was what made them dangerous. If Michael had suddenly become cruel overnight, maybe she would have confronted the truth earlier. Maybe she would have screamed, fought harder, demanded answers. But emotional distance rarely arrives dramatically. It arrives through little things people convince themselves not to notice. Missed dinners, shorter conversations, long pauses where warmth used to live. At first, Sarah blamed stress. Michael's company had expanded aggressively during the second year of their marriage. Government contracts brought larger investors, larger expectations, and endless pressure. His calendar became packed with flights to New York, meetings in Silicon Valley, and late-night strategy calls that stretched past midnight. The city praised him constantly. Business articles called him brilliant, disciplined, focused. Sarah watched people admire the exact thing slowly damaging their marriage. One Friday evening she stood in the kitchen preparing dinner while soft music drifted through the condo speakers. Garlic butter filled the air. Salmon rested inside the oven. She wore one of Michael's oversized hoodies with fuzzy socks, moving around the kitchen quietly while checking the clock every few minutes. 7:42 p.m. Still normal. She poured wine into 2 glasses anyway. By 8:16 p.m. the food was ready. By 8:47 p.m. the silence inside the condo started feeling heavier. Sarah picked up her phone. No calls, no updates. Then finally, a text message. Michael, dinner with investors. Don't wait up. Sarah stared at the screen longer than she wanted to admit. That was it. No apology, no explanation, nothing soft attached to the message. Slowly, she placed the phone face down against the counter. The music suddenly sounded too loud. She turned it off. Then she sat alone at the kitchen island eating food that had already gone cold. Outside, rain moved softly across the Capitol riverfront skyline while headlights reflected across the wet streets below. The condo looked beautiful at night. Floor-to-ceiling windows, expensive furniture, perfect lighting, and somehow the place still felt empty. By the time Michael finally came home after midnight, Sarah had fallen asleep on the couch with Netflix still running quietly in the background. The sound of keys woke her. Michael stepped inside, loosening his tie tiredly. His eyes immediately moved toward her. You should have gone to bed. Sarah pushed herself upright slowly. You missed dinner again. Michael sighed softly while placing his phone onto the counter. I told you I had investors tonight. You told me after dinner was already cold. I'm working, Sarah. Her chest tightened slightly at his tone. Not angry, just emotionally unavailable, like every conversation had become another obligation. Sarah stood carefully. You've been avoiding me. Michael rubbed his forehead immediately. I'm not doing this tonight. You're barely home anymore. That's what happens when people depend on you. No, Sarah replied quietly. That's what happens when people stop trying. For a moment Michael looked irritated. Not guilty, irritated. And somehow that hurt worse. I really don't have the energy for this tonight. The room became still after he said it. Sarah looked at him carefully. Because people reveal things accidentally when they're exhausted. And that sentence didn't sound temporary. It sounded honest. Michael disappeared into the bedroom a few seconds later while Sarah remained standing near the couch, staring at nothing. Something about the condo suddenly felt colder. Over the next few months, Sarah started trying harder, almost too hard. She planned weekend dinners at restaurants Michael used to love. She booked short trips hoping time away from work would help them reconnect. Sometimes she even sat beside him during late-night work sessions just to feel close to him again. But Michael always seemed mentally somewhere else. One Saturday evening, Sarah convinced him to attend a jazz lounge downtown. Back when they first dated, Michael loved places like that. Low music, dim lighting, slow conversations over drinks. For the first 20 minutes, things almost felt normal again. Michael even laughed twice, real laughs. The kind that used to come easily. Sarah caught herself smiling because of it. Then his phone buzzed. Michael checked the screen instantly, and emotionally disappeared again. "You serious right now?" Sarah asked softly. Michael typed quickly without looking up. "It'll take 2 seconds. It took 15 minutes. By the time he finished answering emails, Sarah quietly stared down at her untouched drink. "You know what's sad?" she asked. Michael finally looked up. "What?" "I miss you while sitting right in front of you." Something flickered briefly across his face then. Guilt, maybe, but it vanished almost immediately. "Sarah, no, seriously," she continued quietly. "I feel like I'm competing with your phone, your eye esters, your meetings, everything. You think I enjoy this pressure? I think you stopped noticing how lonely this marriage feels." Michael leaned back heavily in his chair. "You're making this bigger than it is." That sentence almost made her laugh. Because lonely people always hear that eventually. You're overreacting. You're too emotional. You're asking for too much. Meanwhile, all they really wanted was effort. On the drive home, silence filled the car almost the entire way. Streetlights passed across Michael's face while he drove through downtown D.C. without speaking. Sarah watched him carefully from the passenger seat. And honestly, that should have scared her more than it did, because she could already feel herself starting to emotionally adjust to disappointment. That was the part nobody warned people about. Not the fighting, not the crying, the adjustment, the quiet lowering of expectations. Weeks passed, then months. Outside, they still looked perfect. At charity events, Michael held her waist while cameras flashed. They smiled at expensive dinners. Friends complimented their marriage constantly. One woman even told Sarah, during an event, "You two honestly look so solid together." Sarah forced a smile. "Thank you." Meanwhile, she had eaten dinner alone 4 nights that week. One night she tried surprising Michael with a homemade dinner and candles after he returned from a business trip. She wore the black dress he once admitted drove him crazy. For a second when he walked inside, genuine surprise crossed his face. "You did all this?" Sarah smiled hopefully. "Thought maybe we could spend one night together, without work." Michael kissed her forehead distractedly before removing his coat. "Baby, I can't tonight." The hope inside her dropped instantly. "What?" "I've got a conference call in an hour." Sarah stared at him. "You just got home." "I know. You've been gone for 4 days." "I know." The exhaustion in his voice frustrated her even more. Not because he sounded tired. Because he sounded emotionally absent. Like the marriage had become another task he no longer knew how to handle. Sarah folded her arms slowly. "When was the last time you actually looked forward to coming home?" Michael went quiet. Too quiet. That silence answered more than words could. And standing there inside their beautiful condo with candles burning beside untouched food, Sarah felt the first real fear that maybe she was slowly losing her husband long before another woman ever entered the picture. Everything changed on a rainy Tuesday morning. Sarah stood inside the bathroom staring at the pregnancy test in complete silence while water dripped softly from the shower behind her. Positive. For a few seconds she honestly forgot how to breathe. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the sink. Then suddenly she laughed, a nervous, emotional laugh that immediately turned into tears. "Oh my God!" She pressed both hands against her mouth while her heart raced uncontrollably. A baby. The word alone changed the entire room. Fear mixed with excitement so fast she couldn't separate them. But stronger than either emotion was hope. Real hope. Because for the first time in months, Sarah finally believed something could bring Michael back emotionally. Maybe work had simply consumed him. Maybe pressure had changed him temporarily. Maybe they needed something bigger than business meetings and public appearances to reconnect again. A child. Their child. That evening she planned everything carefully. Candles lined the dining table. Soft music played through the condo speakers. She ordered Michael's favorite Italian food from the restaurant they used to visit during their first year together. Even her dress mattered. Blue, the same one Michael once told her made her look dangerously beautiful. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt excited waiting for him to come home. When the front door finally opened around 8:30, rain covered Michael's coat shoulders. He looked exhausted immediately. "Tough day?" Sarah asked softly. Michael loosened his tie slowly while glancing around the condo. "What's all this? Sit down first." Something about her smile made him pause. Michael placed his phone on the counter and walked toward the table carefully. "You're making me nervous." Sarah laughed quietly. "Good nervous or bad nervous?" "That depends." She sat across from him, trying not to smile too hard. Then slowly slid the pregnancy test across the table. For a moment, Michael simply stared at it. No reaction, no emotion, just silence. Then finally, "You're pregnant?" Sarah nodded quickly. "Yes." Another silence, longer this time. Too long. The excitement inside her chest slowly began shrinking. Michael leaned back heavily in his chair and rubbed both hands over his face. Wow. That was it. Not happiness, not disbelief, just wow. Sarah forced a small laugh. "Aren't you happy?" Michael looked away briefly toward the windows. "This is just a lot right now." Her stomach tightened instantly. "A lot? I've got investors watching every move I make right now. Expansion issues, government negotiations, lawsuits. I'm telling you we're having a baby. And I'm telling you the timing is complicated." The warmth disappeared from the room immediately. Sarah stared at him carefully, like she no longer recognized the man sitting across from her. "You don't want this," Michael exhaled hard. "That's not what I said, but honestly..." It was exactly what he said. Neither of them spoke much after that dinner. The candles burned quietly between them while cold food sat untouched on the table. And for the first time since marrying Michael, Sarah felt genuinely afraid about their future. Over the next several weeks, the pregnancy didn't reconnect them. It exposed everything already broken. Michael became even more distant emotionally. Sometimes Sarah woke up around 2 in the morning and found him sitting in the living room answering emails in complete darkness except for the laptop glow against his face. "You should sleep," she whispered one night. Michael barely looked up. "Can't. You've barely talked to me all week. I'm handling a lot right now." Sarah sat beside him carefully. "So am I." Michael finally looked at her then, but instead of comfort, exhaustion filled his expression. That hurt more than anger would have. Doctor appointments became another painful reminder. Most of them Sarah attended alone. The first time Michael canceled last minute, she defended him. The second time, she felt embarrassed. By the fourth appointment, she stopped expecting him entirely. One afternoon, Sarah sat alone in the waiting room surrounded by smiling couples discussing baby names while she scrolled silently through old photos of her marriage. Pictures from Martha's Vineyard vacations, kitchen selfies, late-night dates, a version of Michael that no longer felt real. That realization stayed with her the entire drive home. A week later, things became worse. Sarah had just returned from a prenatal appointment when she heard Michael speaking inside his office upstairs. The door wasn't fully closed. At first, she wasn't even listening. Then she heard the word pregnancy. Sarah froze instantly. The pregnancy changes things. Silence followed. Then Michael again. "If this becomes public during negotiations..." Another pause. "I can't afford distractions right now." Distractions. The word hit her so hard she physically stopped moving. Their child. A distraction. Sarah slowly stepped away from the office before he noticed her standing there. Something inside her shifted quietly after that. Not dramatic, not explosive, just painful clarity. That night Michael barely spoke during dinner, and Sarah barely looked at him. Because once somebody reveals how they truly view you, it becomes impossible to unhear it. The breaking point finally came during a corporate charity banquet downtown. Sarah almost stayed home that night. Pregnancy exhaustion already weighed heavily on her body, and emotionally she felt drained. But appearances mattered to Michael, so she went. The ballroom overflowed with politicians, executives, investors, and camera flashes. Expensive laughter filled the room while waiters carried champagne between tables. Sarah stood beside Michael, smiling politely, while strangers congratulated him on recent business success. Then slowly, almost naturally, Michael drifted away from her. At first Sarah ignored it, but minutes stretched longer. Then nearly an hour passed. Finally she looked across the ballroom. and saw him, Michael, standing beside a blonde investor in a silver dress, laughing, relaxed, his hand resting lightly against the woman's lower back. Too familiar, too comfortable, and honestly, he looked happier in that moment than he had looked with Sarah in months. Something cracked quietly inside her chest. Not jealousy exactly, recognition. Later that night inside the car, Sarah finally asked the question she had been avoiding for weeks. "Are you cheating on me?" Michael tightened both hands on the steering wheel immediately. "No." "Then why does it feel like you already left this marriage?" Streetlights passed across his face while silence filled the car. Finally, Michael spoke quietly. "I don't know if I'm built for this life anymore." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. What does that even mean? The husband thing, the father thing, all of it. Her eyes filled instantly. "You're serious?" Michael looked exhausted. Not emotional. Exhausted. "I didn't plan for any of this." Sarah laughed bitterly through tears. "You married me. I know. You wanted children." Michael looked away toward the road. "I thought I did." That sentence destroyed her completely. The next morning, Michael left before sunrise. By evening, he still hadn't returned home. Then finally, a text message. "Michael, I think we need space for a while." Sarah stared at the screen while rain rolled slowly down the condo windows. No phone call, no conversation, no apology. Just a message from the man she once believed would protect her forever. Slowly, Sarah lowered herself onto the couch and wrapped both arms around her stomach while tears slid silently down her face. Outside, Washington moved on like nothing had happened. But somewhere across the city, another man was about to enter her life in a way none of them were prepared for. For 3 days, Sarah barely left the condo, not because she physically couldn't, because emotionally she didn't know how to. The silence inside the apartment felt different now. Before, it felt temporary. Now it felt final. Michael's side of the closet remained half full. His watches still rested inside the wooden tray near the bedroom dresser. One of his jackets still hung near the front door because he forgot to take it. Little reminders everywhere. That was the cruel part about somebody emotionally leaving before physically leaving. The room still carried traces of them. Sarah spent most mornings sitting near the windows wrapped in a blanket while gray clouds moved slowly above the riverfront outside. Sometimes she picked up her phone hoping to see a message from Michael, an apology, anything. But nothing came, only business notifications, news articles, social media posts praising his latest company expansion. The world still celebrated him while her marriage quietly collapsed behind closed doors. Late Thursday afternoon, her phone finally rang. "Mom." Sarah closed her eyes briefly before answering. "Hey." Her mother became quiet for half a second. "You sound tired, baby." That almost broke her immediately. Because mothers always knew, even through silence. Sarah forced a weak laugh. "I'm okay. No, you're not." Tears instantly filled Sarah's eyes again. She looked away toward the windows quickly. Michael left. Silence. Then softly, "For good?" "I think so." Her mother exhaled slowly on the other end. "Come home for a few days." And honestly, that sounded better than anything else in the world. The next afternoon, Sarah packed slowly, not dramatically. No throwing clothes, no angry breakdown, just exhaustion. By the time she drove towards southeast DC, rush hour traffic had already crowded the streets. Music played softly through the speakers, while familiar neighborhoods slowly replaced the polished luxury surrounding Capitol Riverfront. And immediately, the emotional difference hit her. Here, people actually spoke to each other outside. Kids played basketball near apartment buildings while somebody blasted old-school R&B from a parked car. Women stood on porches talking loudly while grocery bags rested against their hips. Men argued over football near corner stores like the outcome personally affected their blood pressure. Life felt alive here. Messy, warm, human. At a red light, Sarah watched an older couple unloading groceries while arguing about barbecue sauce. "You bought the wrong one again." "It's the same sauce." "It is absolutely not the same sauce." Sarah laughed quietly to herself for the first time in days. And weirdly, that tiny moment almost made her emotional. Because nobody in her luxury building argued outside over barbecue sauce. Nobody sat on porches laughing loudly. Nobody checked on each other naturally. Everything downtown felt polished, controlled, but here, people still belonged to each other. When Sarah finally pulled into the driveway, her mother opened the front door before she even reached it. The smell of fried fish and seasoned rice drifted through the house instantly. Home. That smell alone nearly made Sarah cry. Her mother hugged her tightly without speaking at first, and honestly that mattered more than advice. Some pain needed warmth before conversation. Within an hour, Sarah sat at the kitchen table wearing old sweatpants while her mother moved around the stove quietly. "You eating enough?" her mother asked. "I try. That's not an answer." Sarah smiled weakly. "There's the interrogation. That baby needs strength." The word baby softened the room briefly. Sarah looked down at her hands. "You know what hurts the most?" Her mother turned the stove lower carefully. "What?" "He didn't even fight for us." Silence filled the kitchen for a moment. Then her mother spoke gently. "Some people love deeply when life feels easy." Sarah swallowed hard. "And when life gets hard, that's when character shows up." The words settled heavily inside her chest, because deep down, Sarah already knew Michael failed that test. Meanwhile, across the city, Michael buried himself inside work like a man trying to outrun guilt. The company headquarters overlooked downtown Washington through giant glass walls designed to impress investors before conversations even started. Normally, Michael loved the building. The power, the control. Lately, it just felt exhausting. Employees moved more carefully around him now because his moods had become unpredictable. Short answers, sharp reactions, long silences during meetings. Even small mistakes irritated him immediately. But the truth was simple. Michael wasn't angry at Sarah. He was angry at himself. He just didn't know how to sit with that feeling without trying to escape it through work. Late Friday evening, he stood alone inside his office staring down at traffic below when his assistant knocked carefully. "There's someone here to see you." Michael barely turned around. "I'm busy." He said, "It's important." "Who?" The assistant hesitated slightly. "Brian." Michael's jaw tightened instantly. Of course, Brian. The one person he genuinely hated. Brian carried money differently than most wealthy men in D.C. No performance, no desperate need for attention, old family wealth, private equity empire, real estate investments stretching across the East Coast, calm influence in rooms Michael still fought to dominate. And honestly, that calmness irritated Michael more than arrogance ever could. "Send him in," Michael muttered. A few seconds later, Brian entered wearing a dark coat over a black sweater, looking completely relaxed despite the tension already filling the office. He glanced around casually. "Nice office." Michael crossed his arms immediately. "What do you want?" Brian looked at him carefully for a second. "Straight to hostility. Good. Saves time. I'm not interested in games tonight." Brian stepped farther inside. "I heard about Sarah." Michael's expression hardened immediately. "That's none of your business." Brian remained calm. "You left your pregnant wife alone." Michael looked away toward the windows. "You don't know what's happening." "No," Brian replied quietly. "I know exactly what's happening." The room became still. Michael hated how controlled Brian sounded. Hated it. "I didn't come here to judge you," Brian continued. "Could have fooled me." Brian ignored the comment. "Investors are talking." That got Michael's attention immediately. His eyes narrowed. "What investors?" "The same ones funding your expansion." Michael's stomach tightened slightly. Brian stepped closer slowly. "You're distracted, emotional, making rushed decisions. People notice those things at your level." Michael scoffed bitterly. "So you came here to enjoy the downfall?" Brian surprised him by shaking his head. "No." "Then why are you here?" Brian studied him carefully before answering. "Because you're about to lose something more important than business." Michael said nothing. Because somewhere deep down, he already knew Brian was right. By Saturday afternoon, Sarah's mother had already decided she was leaving the house. Not emotionally, physically. "You've been sitting in this house too long," her mother said while adjusting earrings near the hallway mirror. "I'm pregnant, not imprisoned." And depressed people love saying they're fine while staring at walls all day. Sarah sighed from the couch. "There's a cookout. You're coming?" "I really don't feel like being around people." "That's exactly why you need people." Honestly, arguing with her mother felt pointless after a certain age. 2 hours later, Sarah found herself standing in a backyard surrounded by folding chairs, music, and the smell of grilled chicken drifting through warm evening air. The entire neighborhood sounded alive. Children ran across the grass screaming over water balloons, while older relatives argued loudly about sports near the food table. Somebody played old-school R&B through portable speakers, while a group of women laughed so hard near the patio that one of them nearly dropped her drink. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt something unfamiliar. Relief, not complete happiness, but relief from silence. You better eat before this baby starts protesting, her mother warned while handing her a plate. Sarah laughed softly. There it is again. Threats. That wasn't a threat. That was wisdom. A man near the grill pointed playfully toward Sarah. If this baby comes out singing Anita Baker, blame your mama's playlist. Everybody nearby laughed, even Sarah. A real laugh this time, not forced. That was when she noticed Brian. He stood near the drink table holding a paper plate awkwardly like somebody who absolutely did not belong at a Southeast D.C. cookout. Expensive loafers, dark sweater, confused expression, completely out of place. Sarah blinked slowly. What is he doing here? Her mother glanced over casually. Oh, him? Somebody invited him through business connections with the neighborhood fundraiser. Brian looked up at that exact moment. Their eyes met. For a second, genuine surprise crossed his face. Then he walked toward her carefully. You look slightly less angry than the last time I saw you. Sarah folded her arms. You look extremely uncomfortable. Brian looked down at the paper plate in his hand. I've been judged by 3 aunties already. That means they like you. I'm honestly terrified of them. Sarah laughed again before catching herself. Brian noticed immediately. There it is. What? That laugh. Sarah shook her head lightly. You're weird. I've survived worse insults. Something about talking to him felt easy. Not emotionally heavy, not forced, easy. Brian wasn't trying to impress her. That stood out immediately. Most wealthy men Sarah met performed constantly. Every conversation felt like branding, status, ego, competition. Brian listened more than he talked. That felt rare. As the evening continued, Sarah quietly watched him interact with people around the cookout. He helped carry folding tables without being asked, listened respectfully when older relatives spoke to him, even laughed when children accidentally splashed juice near his shoes. No irritation, no superiority. And honestly, that surprised her. At one point, Sarah sat alone near the back steps, rubbing her lower back tiredly while the sun slowly lowered over the neighborhood. Pregnancy exhaustion hit harder in the evenings now. Brian approached, holding 2 bottled waters. You disappeared. My feet are filing complaints against me. He handed her a bottle. You should sit more. You sound 90 years old. My grandmother would consider that a compliment. Sarah smiled quietly while opening the water. For a moment neither spoke. Music drifted softly across the yard while conversations blended together in the background. Then Brian asked carefully, How are you really doing? The question caught her off guard, not because of the words, because he sounded like he genuinely wanted the answer. I honestly don't know anymore. Brian leaned against the railing nearby but didn't interrupt. That mattered too. He allowed silence naturally, instead of rushing to fix it. I keep replaying everything in my head, Sarah admitted quietly, trying to figure out when things started changing. Brian nodded slightly. That's normal. No, Sarah said softly. What's normal is people falling apart loudly. My marriage just... She searched for the words, faded. Brian looked down briefly. Sometimes that hurts worse. Sarah studied him carefully. You've been through this before. A faint smile crossed his face. That obvious? Yes. Brian looked toward the yard where laughter echoed near the grill. She left when I was 34. Sarah blinked. You were married? Briefly. What happened? Brian thought quietly before answering. I became somebody difficult to love. The honesty surprised her again. Most men with power spent their lives protecting pride. Brian spoke like somebody exhausted from pretending. You still love her? Sarah asked. Brian shook his head once. No. Then, after a small pause, but I regret who I became while loving her. That sentence stayed with Sarah, because it sounded painfully real. Not polished, not dramatic, real. A sudden burst of laughter erupted near the patio when somebody dropped an entire tray of food. Brian looked over instinctively. You know, he said quietly, your neighborhood feels different. Sarah smiled slightly. How? People actually care when somebody disappears for more than 10 minutes. That's because black families don't believe in privacy. Brian laughed softly. I'm starting to notice. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt herself relaxing during conversation instead of emotionally preparing for disappointment. And honestly, that scared her a little too, because comfort becomes dangerous when you've been lonely for too long. The sky slowly darkened overhead while distant thunder rolled somewhere above the city. People started glancing upward. Rain's coming, Sarah murmured. Brian looked toward the clouds. Looked serious, too. The wind shifted colder through the yard, while guests slowly moved chairs beneath covered areas. For a few seconds, Sarah watched families laughing together, while music continued softly in the background. Then quietly, almost to herself, she asked, "If somebody abandoned you during your hardest moment, would you ever forgive them?" Brian looked at her carefully, not rushed, not careless. He thought about it first. Finally, he answered honestly, "I think forgiveness and trust are two different things." Sarah swallowed quietly, because deep down, she already knew exactly what he meant. A cold drop of rain landed against her arm, then another. Within seconds, the sky opened harder. People rushed toward cover, laughing loudly, while somebody yelled about saving the food from the rain. Brian stood immediately. "You drove here?" "Yeah, you shouldn't drive alone in this weather." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You think pregnancy erased my driving skills?" "No," Brian replied calmly. "I think DC drivers already act insane before storms." That made her laugh again. But outside, the rain kept falling harder. And neither of them realized yet that before the night ended, everything between them was about to change forever. The rain started lightly at first. By the time Sarah pulled away from the cookout, it had turned violent. Water slammed against the windshield so hard the streets ahead blurred beneath waves of headlights and red brake lights. Thunder rolled above Washington while traffic crawled through intersections already beginning to flood. Sarah tightened both hands around the steering wheel. Her back ached, her legs felt heavy, and suddenly the exhaustion from the entire week crashed into her body all at once. At the next red light, she closed her eyes briefly, just for a second, breathed. The rain hammered harder against the roof. Her phone buzzed inside the cup holder. Mom checking on her. Sarah reached for it carefully. Then pain hit, sharp, sudden. A gasp escaped her instantly. Her hand flew toward her stomach. Oh God. Another pain followed almost immediately. Stronger. Sarah's breathing turned uneven. "No, please no." The light turned green ahead of her while cars behind started honking impatiently, but Sarah couldn't move. Her fingers tightened against the steering wheel while fear slowly climbed into her throat. Something felt wrong, very wrong. Behind her, Brian noticed her brake lights still frozen in place after traffic moved forward. At first, he assumed her car stalled. Then he saw her silhouette bend forward sharply inside the driver's seat. His stomach dropped instantly. Brian pulled his SUV onto the side of the road and jumped out into the rain without hesitation. Cold water soaked through his clothes immediately while horns echoed through the intersection. By the time he reached her car door, Sarah looked pale, terrified. Brian opened the door quickly. "Sarah." Her eyes lifted toward him weakly, and that expression alone told him everything. "I think—" Her voice trembled painfully. "Something's wrong with the baby." Brian crouched beside her immediately. "Okay, look at me." Another cramp hit her hard enough to make her grab the side of the seat. Brian's voice stayed calm. "You're okay. We're getting to the hospital right now." Sarah tried breathing steadily, but panic already shook through her chest. Brian carefully helped her out of the car, while rain poured around them in violent sheets. The moment her knees weakened slightly, his arm wrapped firmly around her back. "I've got you," he said quietly. And honestly, those words nearly broke her, because Michael hadn't sounded protective in months. Brian moved quickly without becoming frantic. Within seconds, he helped her into the passenger seat of his SUV before rushing around to the driver's side. The windshield wipers fought aggressively against the storm as he pulled into traffic. "You still with me?" he asked. Sarah nodded weakly while gripping her stomach. "I'm scared." Brian glanced toward her briefly. "I know. No fake reassurance. No empty promises. Just honesty." For a moment, only rain filled the SUV. Then Brian spoke again. "My mother almost died having my younger sister." Sarah turned toward him weakly. Brian kept his eyes on the road. "My father completely lost it at the hospital. Couldn't speak straight. I remember watching him panic and thinking." He exhaled softly. "Love makes people helpless sometimes." Sarah swallowed painfully. "And Michael?" Brian remained quiet for a second too long. Finally, "Michael confuses control with strength." The words settled heavily between them. 20 minutes later, they rushed through the emergency entrance at George Washington University Hospital. Everything afterward moved fast. Bright lights, nurses asking questions, wheelchairs, forms, machines. Sarah barely kept up while waves of pain rolled through her body. "How far along are you? Any bleeding? Pain level from 1 to 10. Brian stayed close the entire time while doctors checked her vitals. One nurse glanced toward him. "Husband?" Before Sarah could answer, Brian calmly replied, "No, I'm the one who brought her." Something about the way he said it made Sarah emotional again. Not possessive, protective. Hours passed slowly afterward. Doctors eventually explained that severe emotional stress had dangerously elevated Sarah's blood pressure. The baby remained okay, but she needed rest immediately. "Stress during pregnancy affects everything," the doctor warned gently. "You cannot continue carrying this level of emotional pressure." Sarah almost laughed at that, as if emotions could simply be turned off. By midnight, the storm outside finally weakened. Inside the hospital room, Sarah sat quietly beneath thin blankets while city lights glowed faintly through the windows. Brian remained there, even after everything settled. "You can go home," Sarah murmured tiredly. Brian looked up from the chair near the window. "You sure? You've already done enough." Instead of answering immediately, he walked toward the window overlooking downtown Washington. "You know something funny?" he asked softly. "What?" "I spent years thinking money solved everything." Sarah watched him carefully. And some nights you realize money can't make somebody love you correctly." The room became still. There was loneliness inside his voice, too. Not dramatic, buried, experienced. "You really loved your wife," Sarah said quietly. Brian gave a faint smile without looking at her. Enough to become somebody she stopped recognizing. That sentence stayed with Sarah long after he said it. Eventually, exhaustion pulled her asleep. Brian stayed anyway. Not because he had to, because leaving felt wrong. Meanwhile, across the city, Michael sat alone inside his office, staring at missed calls from Sarah lighting up his phone screen. 6 missed calls. He noticed them hours ago. Still, he never called back. Work had consumed the entire night again. Meetings, investor pressure, endless noise distracting him from feelings he no longer knew how to face. Then his phone buzzed again, this time from a business gossip account. Michael opened it absently and froze. Blurry photographs filled the screen. Brian helping Sarah through the rain outside the hospital. The caption underneath read, "DC Billionaire. Brian spotted protecting pregnant wife of rival CEO Michael during late-night hospital emergency." Michael's chest tightened instantly. Not anger first, jealousy, because another man showed up for Sarah while he ignored her calls. The next morning, Michael arrived at the hospital looking exhausted and emotionally wrecked beneath his polished appearance. The moment he entered the room, he saw Brian sitting beside Sarah's bed holding untouched coffee. The tension became immediate, heavy. Michael looked directly at Sarah. "What happened?" Sarah folded her arms slowly. "You ignored my calls." Michael looked uncomfortable immediately. "I didn't know it was serious." "No," Sarah replied quietly. "You just didn't care enough to check." Before Michael could respond, Brian stood calmly. "She needed help." Michael's jaw tightened. "She has a husband." Brian looked directly at him. "You were supposed to protect her." Silence crushed the room instantly. Michael stared at Sarah, and for the first time since marrying her, she looked emotionally safer beside somebody else. The hospital photos spread faster than Michael expected. By noon the next day, half of Washington's business circles had already seen them. Blurry images, rain-soaked parking garage, Brian helping Sarah through the storm while she clutched her stomach. The gossip blogs treated it like entertainment. DC tech golden couple facing separation, billionaire rival seen escorting pregnant wife of CEO during emergency. Where was Michael? That last headline irritated him the most, because deep down, he knew exactly where he had been, ignoring her calls. Michael sat inside his office staring at article after article while frustration tightened across his chest. His assistant knocked carefully before entering. "The board meeting starts in 15 minutes. Michael rubbed both hands over his face. "Move it. They're already waiting. I said move it." The sharpness in his voice startled even him. His assistant nodded quickly and stepped back out. The moment the office door closed again, Michael leaned back heavily in his chair. Everything suddenly felt loud. Phones buzzing, emails flooding in, investors requesting reassurance, and beneath all of it sat something far worse than stress. Shame. Real shame. Not because strangers were talking, because Brian had done what he failed to do. Show up. Meanwhile, Sarah remained at the hospital another night for observation. The storm had passed outside, but exhaustion still sat heavily beneath her skin. Her blood pressure stabilized slowly, though doctors warned her repeatedly about emotional stress. "You need calm right now," one nurse told her gently while checking monitors. "Your body's carrying too much tension." If only emotions listened to instructions that easily. Late that afternoon, Sarah sat quietly near the hospital window watching traffic move below downtown Washington. For the first time in weeks, her phone barely stopped buzzing. Friends, acquaintances, people pretending concern while secretly searching for details. One message annoyed her more than the others. Girl, are the rumors true? Rumors, like her marriage collapsing with celebrity entertainment. Sarah tossed the phone onto the bed in frustration. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Brian stepped inside carrying coffee and fresh fruit. You look irritated, Sarah exhaled sharply. The internet turned my life into a group project. Brian placed the coffee carefully beside her. That's Washington for you. People treat pain like networking material. That almost made her laugh. Almost. Brian noticed the untouched hospital food tray near the bed. You didn't eat. I'm tired of people monitoring me. You're pregnant. Monitoring comes with a package. Sarah rolled her eyes slightly. There you go, sounding 90 again. My knees already feel elderly. That finally pulled a small laugh out of her. Brian smiled briefly after hearing it, then quietly handed her the coffee. Decaf. Relax. You really don't trust me with caffeine? I don't trust anybody emotionally unstable with stimulants. Sarah stared at him. You calling me unstable? You threw mashed potatoes at Michael during an argument once. Her eyes widened immediately. How do you know that? Brian took a sip of his own coffee calmly. Michael told me. Sarah covered her face in embarrassment. Oh my God. In fairness, Brian continued, he deserved it from the story I heard. That is absolutely not helping. For the first time in days, the room felt lighter, not romantic, safe. That difference mattered. Across the city, Michael's situation worsened quickly. Investors began questioning his judgment privately, not because of the marriage itself, because instability made wealthy people nervous, especially during expansion periods. Inside a conference room overlooking downtown, Michael sat through one of the worst meetings of his career. An older investor adjusted his glasses carefully before speaking. The market doesn't like distractions. Michael's jaw tightened immediately. My personal life has nothing to do with company performance. Public perception affects everything. Another investor leaned forward slightly. Photos of your pregnant wife entering hospitals with your biggest competitor create unnecessary headlines. Michael's patience thinned dangerously. My wife's medical emergency is not a branding discussion. No, the investor replied calmly. But your emotional instability is becoming one. Silence crushed the room. Michael looked around the table slowly. For years, these same people praised his aggression, his ambition, his obsession with control. Now suddenly they looked at him like damaged stock. That realization burned inside him all afternoon. By evening, Michael sat alone inside his penthouse, staring out across Washington while whiskey rested untouched beside him. Normally he drank when stress became overwhelming. Tonight he couldn't even stomach it, because every time he closed his eyes, he pictured Sarah holding Brian's hand inside that hospital room. Not romantically. Worse, trusting him. That image kept replaying in his head endlessly. Meanwhile, Sarah slowly recovered over the next several days at her mother's house after being discharged. And something subtle started changing emotionally. Not love, not attraction, safety. Brian checked on her regularly without overwhelming her. Some mornings he simply dropped off groceries and left. Other days he texted short messages. Eat something green today. Your blood pressure behaving. Don't fight anybody before noon. The messages felt oddly comforting. No pressure attached, no emotional confusion, just consistency. And after months of emotional disappointment from Michael, consistency felt powerful. One afternoon, Sarah stepped outside her mother's house and immediately noticed photographers' arcade farther down the street. Her stomach dropped. Seriously? Before she could even process what to do, Brian's SUV pulled up beside the curb. He stepped out quickly, expression hardening the moment he saw the cameras. You've got to be kidding me. A photographer lifted a camera immediately. Sarah, are you leaving Michael? Brian stepped directly in front of her without hesitation. No photos. Is the baby okay? Did Michael abandon you? Sarah froze slightly. The questions felt invasive. Cruel. Brian opened the passenger door calmly. Get in. One photographer moved closer. Brian, are you involved with her now? Brian finally looked directly at him. She's pregnant and recovering from stress complications. Act like human beings. The photographer stepped back slightly at the coldness in Brian's voice. Sarah climbed into the SUV quietly while her chest tightened emotionally. Not because of the cameras, because somebody protected her without needing to be asked. Once inside the vehicle, silence filled the space for a moment. Then Sarah quietly said, "You didn't have to do that." Brian started the engine slowly. "Yes," he replied calmly. "I did. And somewhere across the city at that exact moment." Michael watched another gossip article appear online showing Brian shielding Sarah from porters. For the first time in his life, Michael felt himself losing control of both his image and the woman he still loved. After the hospital incident, Brian quietly became part of Sarah's routine. Not aggressively, not in a way that demanded attention. He just showed up. That consistency started changing things inside her before she even realized it. Tuesday mornings became doctor appointment mornings, and somehow Brian always appeared outside her mother's townhouse 10 minutes early with coffee waiting inside the SUV. One morning, Sarah stepped outside wearing leggings and an oversized sweater while carefully balancing her purse against her shoulder. Brian lowered his sunglasses slightly the moment he saw her. "You're late," Sarah frowned immediately. "I'm 2 minutes early. You were supposed to be emotionally prepared before that." She stared at him. That sentence made absolutely no sense. Brian handed her coffee through the open passenger door. "Exactly. Pregnancy brain," Sarah gasped dramatically. "You know what? I'm starting to understand why Michael finds you irritating." Brian looked genuinely thoughtful for a second. "That might be the nicest thing you've said to me." She laughed despite herself, while climbing into the SUV. The small moments mattered. That was the strange part. Not grand gestures, not dramatic speeches, small things. Brian remembering she hated overly sweet coffee. Brian slowing down over potholes without thinking about it. Brian quietly carrying extra snacks because pregnancy nausea hit her randomly now. Nobody had cared for her gently in a long time. At the doctor's office, Sarah noticed something else changing too. She stopped feeling alone. The waiting room no longer felt emotionally humiliating. Brian sat beside her, scrolling through emails quietly while couples around them discussed baby names and nursery colors. At one point, a nurse stepped into the waiting area smiling warmly. "Dad can come with you now." Sarah opened her mouth immediately. "Oh, he's not." Brian stood calmly already. "We'll be right there." Sarah looked at him once they entered the hallway. "You could have corrected her." Brian shrugged lightly. She seemed happy for 5 seconds. Didn't feel necessary to ruin it. Sarah shook her head, trying not to smile. Inside the examination room, the doctor reviewed new scans while discussing stress management again. "Blood pressure looks better this week." Brian leaned back casually in the chair nearby. "That's because I threatened her with vegetables." Sarah looked offended. "You bought kale. You say that like I committed a felony." "You did." The doctor laughed softly while continuing paperwork. For a moment the room felt normal, comfortable, and honestly, that scared Sarah sometimes. Because comfort made people emotionally vulnerable. After appointments, Brian usually drove her back home immediately. But one evening traffic near downtown became terrible after an accident blocked several streets. Rain tapped lightly against the SUV, while brake lights stretched endlessly ahead. Sarah leaned her head against the seat tiredly. "Washington traffic makes me question humanity." Brian nodded seriously. "I fully support relocating Congress to Alaska. That might actually improve everybody's mood." Brian glanced toward her briefly. "There's the laugh again." Sarah looked out the window. What laugh? The real one. Silence settled softly between them after that. Not awkward silence. Peaceful silence. There was a difference. Eventually, Sarah spoke quietly. "You know what's embarrassing?" Brian kept his eyes on the road. "What?" "I spent months blaming myself for Michael changing." Brian didn't interrupt. That was another thing about him. He listened without rushing people emotionally. Sarah stared out at the city lights sliding past outside. "I kept thinking if I became more patient, more understanding, prettier, calmer." She swallowed quietly. "Maybe he'd love me the way he used to." Brian's jaw tightened slightly. "That's not how love works." Sarah laughed bitterly. "Tell that to half the women in D.C. The words lingered heavily inside the SUV. After a moment, Brian finally said, "Michael loved ambition more than honesty." Sarah looked toward him slowly. That's a harsh thing to say about your rival. It's a true thing. His voice remained calm. Not bitter, just honest. Sarah studied him carefully. You really know him, don't you? Brian nodded once. We started in business around the same time. He paused briefly. Difference is, I recognized that success was turning me into before it completely destroyed my life. Sarah thought about that quietly. You still think about your marriage a lot. Brian gave a faint smile. Some mistakes stay expensive emotionally. The honesty in his voice settled deeply inside her. No performance, no pretending to be emotionally invincible. Just truth. That felt rare. Over the next couple of weeks, their conversations grew longer naturally. Some nights Brian called simply to check whether she ate dinner. Other nights they sat outside her mother's house talking inside the parked SUV long after arriving home. One evening Sarah laughed so hard at one of Brian's stories about accidentally offending wealthy investors at a golf event that tears filled her eyes. You told a senator his handshake felt aggressive? Brian looked completely serious. It did. You cannot say that to people. He squeezed first. Sarah covered her face, laughing harder. You're unbelievable, Brian smiled quietly while watching her. And for a brief second, something warm crossed his expression before he looked away. Later that same night, Sarah suddenly pressed a hand against her stomach mid-conversation. Brian's attention shifted instantly. You okay? Her eyes widened softly. Wait. Another small movement pressed beneath her hand. Sarah looked stunned. Oh my God! Brian leaned slightly forward. What happened? The baby kicked. For a second, neither moved. Sarah slowly grabbed his wrist carefully. Here. Brian hesitated briefly before placing his hand gently against her stomach. Another tiny kick landed beneath his palm. Brian froze completely. The expression on his face changed instantly. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, quiet wonder. Sarah watched him carefully, and honestly, that might have been the softest she had ever seen him look. Brian slowly pulled his hand back, almost like he forgot himself for a second. She's strong, he murmured quietly. Sarah smiled faintly. You think it's a girl? I have no idea. He paused briefly. But she already has attitude. Sarah laughed softly again. But afterward, once the laughter faded, something shifted emotionally inside the vehicle. Not romance, something deeper first. Connection. Because for the first time since her marriage started collapsing, Sarah no longer felt emotionally alone carrying this baby. And Brian? Brian drove home later that night realizing something uncomfortable, somewhere along the way. He had stopped thinking about Sarah as Michael's wife. Michael started trying again the moment he realized Sarah no longer waited for him emotionally. That terrified him more than the gossip blogs, more than investors questioning his judgment, more than Brian. Because for the first time since their marriage began falling apart, Sarah had stopped reaching toward him. And people never understood how dangerous emotional silence became once a woman stopped fighting for the relationship. At first, Michael approached the situation the only way he knew how. Through solutions, expensive solutions. 3 days after the hospital incident, a luxury floral arrangement arrived at Sarah's mother's house, large enough to block half the doorway. Her mother stared at it for a long moment. This man bought enough flowers for a funeral. Sarah sighed from the couch. There's a card. Her mother picked it up carefully. You reading it, or should I prepare myself emotionally first? Sarah held out her hand. The handwriting was Michael's. I'm sorry for everything. Let me fix this. That was it. No mention of the baby. No mention of abandonment. No mention of the hospital. Just another polished sentence from a man who still thought problems could be managed professionally. Sarah placed the card down quietly. You not calling him? Her mother asked. I don't even know what I'd say anymore. The flowers remained untouched near the entrance for 2 days before her mother finally moved them outside. After that came gifts, designer baby furniture, expensive care packages, a prenatal spa reservation Sarah never used. Every delivery made her more tired emotionally, because none of it addressed the actual damage. Michael still didn't understand the difference between providing and showing up. One afternoon, Brian arrived at the townhouse carrying grocery bags and stopped halfway up the porch stairs after noticing unopened packages near the door. He glanced towards Sarah sitting outside beneath a blanket. Michael trying to buy forgiveness? Sarah gave a tired laugh. He's attempting emotional customer service. Brian almost smiled. That sounds exhausting. It is. He carried the groceries inside without pushing the conversation further. That restraint mattered too. Brian never forced emotional discussions when Sarah looked drained. Meanwhile, Michael became increasingly consumed by the idea of Brian, not just because Brian protected Sarah, because Sarah softened around him now. Michael noticed it immediately during phone calls. Her voice sounded calmer whenever Brian's name came up, less guarded, less wounded. And every time Michael imagined another man becoming emotionally important to his wife during pregnancy, jealousy tightened deeper inside his chest. One evening, Michael finally called instead of texting. Sarah stared at the phone for nearly 30 seconds before answering. "Hello?" Michael exhaled softly at the sound of her voice. "How are you feeling?" "Tired. How's the baby?" That question almost made Sarah laugh bitterly. Now he wanted updates. "She's okay." Silence followed briefly. Then Michael spoke carefully. "Can we have dinner?" Sarah looked out the window quietly. "What for?" "I want to talk. We've had months to talk." "I know. And you spent most of them emotionally disappearing." Michael closed his eyes briefly on the other end. "I'm trying now." The words sat heavily between them. Finally, Sarah answered softly. "Trying after losing somebody feels different than trying to keep them." That sentence followed Michael long after the call ended. A week later, he convinced Sarah to meet him at a quiet restaurant near Georgetown, the same neighborhood where they first met. Michael arrived early, nervous, actually nervous. That feeling irritated him because he normally controlled every room he entered. Tonight he felt uncertain. When Sarah finally walked inside wearing a long cream-colored coat over her dress, Michael stood immediately, and for a second his chest tightened painfully, because she still looked beautiful to him, still looked like home, but emotionally, she felt farther away than ever. "You look good," he said quietly. Sarah sat down carefully. "You said you wanted to talk. No warmth, no flirtation, just exhaustion." Michael noticed it instantly. Dinner arrived, but neither touched much food. Finally, Michael leaned forward slightly. "I know I failed you." Sarah stared down at her water glass. "You abandoned me during pregnancy, Michael." His jaw tightened. "I was overwhelmed. You left me alone. I didn't know how to handle everything happening." Sarah looked at him carefully then. "For months I begged you to talk to me, to notice me, to fight for us." Her voice stayed calm, which somehow hurt more. And every single time, work mattered more. Michael rubbed both hands together slowly. "That's not true." "It is true." "No," he said quietly. "You mattered too." Sarah's expression softened sadly. "That's the problem." Michael looked confused. "You made me feel like I came after everything else." Silence settled heavily over the table. Around them, glasses clinked softly while conversations blurred together throughout the restaurant. Life continued normally around two people quietly watching their marriage die. Then Michael asked the question he had been avoiding for weeks. "Are you in love with Brian?" Sarah looked genuinely surprised. "No." The relief hit him instantly. But it disappeared just as fast when she continued. "That doesn't change the fact he was there when you weren't." Michael looked away toward the window. "He's using the situation." Sarah shook her head immediately. "No, you just don't understand him." That sentence bothered Michael deeply. Because she defended Brian naturally now, without hesitation. Michael leaned back heavily. "You think he cares about you? I know he cares, and you trust him that quickly." Sarah laughed softly in disbelief. "Michael, I trusted you for years." That landed hard, painfully hard. For a moment neither spoke. Then Michael quietly admitted something that surprised even himself. "I hate seeing him near you." Sarah studied him carefully. "Because you love me?" Michael nodded immediately, but Sarah's eyes filled with sadness instead of comfort. "No," she whispered. "You only miss me because somebody else showed up when you didn't." The words shattered him completely. Because deep down, he knew she was right. Michael sat frozen while Sarah slowly stood from the table. For a second she looked like she wanted to say something softer, something comforting, but emotional exhaustion had finally replaced hope. "I loved you very deeply," she admitted quietly. "I just got tired of feeling lonely beside you." Then she walked away, and Michael remained sitting there alone inside the restaurant, long after she disappeared through the doors. For the first time in his life, success could not help him. Money could not help him. Control could not help him. Because another man now understood Sarah emotionally in ways he no longer could. And somewhere deep inside, Michael finally realized he might have lost her long before Brian ever entered the picture. Michael stopped sleeping properly after the dinner with Sarah. At first he blamed stress, then work, then whiskey. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was finally running out of distractions. The silence inside his penthouse had started feeling unbearable. Every room reminded him of Sarah now. Her favorite blanket still rested across the couch. One of her skincare bottles remained beside the bathroom sink because she forgot to pack it weeks ago. Little things everywhere. The kind of things people stop noticing until somebody leaves. One night around 2 a.m, Michael sat alone inside his office wearing a wrinkled dress shirt while city lights glowed beyond the windows. His laptop screen reflected spreadsheets he could barely focus on anymore. Numbers, investor reports, projected losses. None of it felt real tonight. His phone buzzed suddenly. A message from the blonde investor woman. Michael stared at the screen for a long moment before opening it. "We need to discuss damage control before the gala." Damage control. That was how she described his collapsing marriage now. Michael tossed the phone onto the desk in frustration, because somewhere along the way he had allowed powerful people to convince him emotions were liabilities, and now he barely recognized himself anymore. The truth was uglier than Sarah knew. Months before the pregnancy, Michael's company had quietly started struggling financially behind the scenes. Not publicly. Publicly, the company looked unstoppable. But internally, government contract negotiations had become unstable. Investors wanted faster expansion. Several executives warned Michael the company was growing too aggressively, but slowing down would make shareholders nervous. And nervous investors became dangerous quickly, especially in Washington. The pressure consumed him little by little. Every meeting became about perception, stability, image, control. Then Sarah got pregnant. At first, Michael actually sat alone inside his office, smiling at the pregnancy test photo she texted him privately before the dinner reveal. For one brief moment, he felt happy. Real happy. Then reality returned. The company was already under pressure. Investors were already questioning his emotional focus, and several wealthy backers quietly believed family complications weakened ambitious men, especially during expansion periods. The blonde investor woman made that painfully clear one evening after a board dinner. Michael still remembered standing near the valet area while she adjusted her coat beside him. "You need to stay focused, right now." Michael frowned slightly. "My marriage has nothing to do with business. In your world?" she replied calmly. "Everything affects business." Michael looked irritated immediately. "She's my wife. She's also pregnant during a financially unstable period, while gossip media already follows you." Her expression stayed calm. Investors don't like unpredictability. That conversation stayed inside Michael's head for weeks afterward. Not because he agreed with it completely, because part of him feared it might be true. And fear mixed with ambition creates dangerous decisions. The more pressure built at work, the colder Michael became at home. Not intentionally at first. He simply stopped emotionally engaging with anything that made him feel vulnerable, including Sarah. Especially Sarah, because loving her reminded him how much he could lose. And somewhere during all that pressure, Michael made the worst mistake of his life. He started treating emotional distance like survival. Now, sitting alone inside the office weeks later, he finally understood the damage. He wasn't protecting his future, he was destroying it. The next morning, Michael arrived at company headquarters looking exhausted. The board meeting already waited for him upstairs. The moment he entered the conference room, tension filled the air immediately. Nobody smiled. That alone told him everything. One investor slid a financial report across the table calmly. "We have concerns." Michael remained standing. About public instability, media attention, delayed negotiations. Michael's jaw tightened. "The company is still profitable. For now." Another investor leaned forward carefully. "You assured us personal matters wouldn't interfere with leadership." Michael stared coldly across the table. "My wife's pregnancy is not a company liability." The blonde investor woman finally spoke. "No. But emotional decision-making is." Michael looked at her sharply. For the first time, something inside him snapped slightly. Not explosive anger, clarity, because suddenly he saw the entire situation differently. These people never cared about him. Not really. They cared about performance, control, results. And somewhere during his obsession with success, he sacrificed the one person who genuinely loved him without conditions. Sarah. The realization hit so hard it physically exhausted him. After the meeting ended, Michael remained alone inside the conference room, staring at the skyline beyond the glass walls. Then quietly, almost painfully, he laughed to himself. Because Brian warned him weeks ago. You're about to lose something more important than business." At the time, Michael thought Brian was provoking him. Now he understood. Brian saw the emotional collapse before he did. Later that evening, Michael drove toward Southeast DC without fully deciding why. Part of him wanted to see Sarah. Part of him knew he didn't deserve to. When he finally parked near her mother's house, lights glowed softly through the front windows while distant music drifted somewhere down the street. Normal life. Warm life. The kind of life Michael used to think he had outgrown. Then he saw something that made his chest tighten painfully. Brian stood on the porch laughing quietly while Sarah leaned against the doorway smiling at him. Not dramatic, not romantic. Worse, comfortable, natural. Like safety had slowly grown between them while Michael was busy protecting a company already starting to consume him alive, and sitting alone inside his car that night. Michael finally admitted something to himself for the very first time. He didn't abandon Sarah because he stopped loving her. He abandoned her because he became too weak emotionally to handle loving her properly. The weather turned colder during the following weeks. Washington moved deeper into late autumn, while Sarah's pregnancy became harder to hide beneath oversized sweaters and coats. Everything about her body felt heavier now. Walking upstairs, sleeping comfortably, even standing too long in the kitchen irritated her lower back. One evening, Sarah stood inside her mother's kitchen trying unsuccessfully to open a stubborn jar while muttering complaints under her breath. "This child already hates me." Brian looked up from the grocery bags he carried inside. "That seems dramatic. She kicked me in the ribs for 20 straight minutes today." Brian walked closer calmly. "Maybe she's protesting your music choices." Sarah frowned. "You don't even know my playlist. You still listen to sad 90s R&B while emotionally processing life. That is called culture." Brian took the jar from her hands easily and opened it in 2 seconds. Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "Oh, now you're showing off. I'm naturally gifted." "You open pickles, Brian." "Strength is strength." That made her laugh again. The sound came easier around him lately. Not because life suddenly stopped hurting. Because she no longer felt emotionally alone inside the pain. Later that evening, rain tapped softly against the windows while Sarah sat curled near the living room couch, rubbing her stomach absent-mindedly. Brian remained nearby, answering emails quietly from his laptop. The room felt peaceful, comfortable, and honestly, that comfort started frightening Sarah sometimes. Because people rarely noticed emotional attachment while it was happening. It arrived quietly, through consistency, through safety, through somebody remembering how you take your coffee without asking again. Sarah looked toward Brian carefully. "You know something weird?" Brian glanced up. "What?" "You never make me feel guilty for being emotional." He studied her for a second before answering. "That's because pregnancy is emotional." "No," Sarah replied softly. "I mean in general." Brian closed the laptop slowly. For a moment he seemed to choose his words carefully. "A lot of people only know how to love others when everything feels convenient." The sentence landed heavily between them, because it sounded painfully familiar. Sarah looked down toward her hands. "I spent so much time trying not to become difficult for Michael." Brian stayed quiet. That silence invited honesty from her. "I started shrinking pieces of myself without realizing it," she admitted softly. "I stopped complaining when he canceled dinner. Stopped asking why he worked late constantly. Stopped talking about things that upset me because I already knew he'd look exhausted before I finished speaking." Her voice cracked slightly near the end. Not dramatically, tired. Brian's expression tightened quietly. "You should never have to earn basic emotional care." Sarah laughed weakly. "That sounds obvious now. It should have sounded obvious then too." The room became quiet again. Outside, headlights slid across wet streets while distant thunder rolled softly above the city. Finally, Sarah asked something she had avoided for weeks. "Why are you really doing all this for me?" Brian leaned back slowly. "What do you mean? You barely even liked me before all this happened." "That's not true." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You called me emotionally dangerous once." Brian looked almost embarrassed. "In fairness, you threw mashed potatoes at Michael." "He deserved it. He absolutely deserved it." She laughed softly again. Then the laughter faded. "But seriously," Sarah continued quietly, "you didn't have to step into this mess." Brian looked at her for a long moment before answering. "I know." Something shifted emotionally after he said that. Not tension exactly. Honesty. For the first time since they met, neither of them hid behind humor. Brian rubbed his hands together slowly before speaking again. "I think..." He paused briefly. I think watching somebody go through pain, you recognize CNG's things. Sarah's chest tightened slightly. You saw yourself in me. Brian nodded once. I know what it feels like when love slowly becomes loneliness. That sentence sat deeply inside her, because nobody had understood her marriage that clearly before, not even her. The baby suddenly kicked hard enough to make Sarah wince softly. Brian straightened immediately. You okay? Yeah, she exhaled carefully. She's practicing karate tonight, apparently. Brian moved closer without thinking. You sure? Sarah nodded while pressing both hands against her stomach. Then another stronger kick landed. Her face changed instantly. Fear flashed there briefly. Brian noticed immediately. What's wrong? She usually doesn't move this hard. The worry in her voice shifted the entire room. Within minutes, Brian helped her sit more comfortably while quietly calling the doctor's after-hours line. Sarah tried staying calm, but anxiety already crawled through her chest again. The hospital scare still haunted her. Every unusual pain frightened her now. Brian stayed beside her the entire call, focused, steady, grounding. After speaking with the doctor, Brian finally exhaled softly. She's okay. They said increased movement can happen during this stage. Sarah closed her eyes briefly in relief. God! Without thinking, Brian reached for her hand, and this time, neither of them pulled away immediately. The contact felt different, warmer, still. Sarah slowly looked up at him. Brian's thumb brushed lightly across her knuckles before he seemed to realize what he was doing, but he still didn't let go. You scared me, he admitted quietly. Something emotional moved across Sarah's face then. Not excitement, not guilt, recognition. Because nobody had sounded afraid to lose her in a very long time. The room became incredibly quiet, rain against windows, soft breathing. Nothing else. Then Brian finally spoke carefully. I'm trying very hard not to make this complicated. Sarah's heart tightened instantly, because she understood exactly what he meant. You are making it complicated, she whispered softly. Brian gave a faint, tired smile. Yeah, I know. Neither moved. Neither looked away. And for one dangerous second, Sarah imagined what it would feel like to kiss him. Not because she forgot Michael. Because Brian felt emotionally safe in a way she no longer recognized. That realization scared her more than attraction itself. Slowly, Sarah pulled her hand back first. Not harshly, carefully, because some emotional lines changed everything once crossed fully. Brian looked down briefly before nodding once like he understood. And honestly, that restraint made her chest ache even more. A few minutes later, Sarah finally spoke softly without looking at him. You know something terrifying? What? Safe love feels different. Brian didn't answer immediately, but the sadness in his eyes told her he understood exactly what she meant. And somewhere deep inside both of them, everything had already started changing. If somebody protected you during your worst season, could you stop yourself from falling for M? Washington loved public success. But the city loved public collapse even more. That became painfully obvious the night of the gala. The event took place inside one of the most expensive hotel ballrooms downtown, where politicians, executives, lobbyists, and investors gathered beneath gold lighting pretending their conversations weren't entirely transactional. Normally, Michael dominated rooms like this. He understood power language, firm handshakes, controlled smiles, strategic eye contact. For years, people moved around him carefully because success surrounded him like armor. Tonight felt different the second he walked inside. People still greeted him politely, but now they watched him too closely. That was how wealthy circles punished weakness. Not loudly, quietly, through distance. Michael adjusted the cuff of his suit while conversation shifted around him in subtle waves. He noticed investors speaking in smaller groups than usual. A few executives avoided discussing upcoming deals near him entirely. Nobody trusted instability, and lately Michael looked unstable. The blonde investor woman approached him near the bar carrying champagne. You're late, Michael barely looked at her. Traffic. No, she replied calmly. Emotions. His jaw tightened instantly. I'm not doing this tonight. You don't have a choice anymore. Michael finally looked at her fully, and for the first time, he noticed something cold in her expression. Not concern. Calculation. She lowered her voice slightly. The board's considering restructuring. Michael stared at her. What? You've become a liability. For a second, he genuinely thought he misheard her. "That's impossible. Your company value dropped 6% in 2 weeks because of media instability and delayed contracts." Michael laughed once in disbelief. "So now everybody suddenly panics because my marriage collapsed? Because you lost control publicly?" That sentence hit harder than she intended. Because deep down, Michael already knew it was true. The blonde investor woman took a sip of champagne casually. "You should have separated quietly before the pregnancy became emotional news." Michael's expression darkened immediately. "You think this is strategy to me? I think powerful men survive by prioritizing correctly." Something inside him snapped then. Not loudly. Completely. Because suddenly he realized how long he had surrounded himself with people who viewed love like inconvenience. People who treated Sarah like a disruption instead of his wife. And somehow, he let them influence him. Across the ballroom, another wave of attention shifted suddenly toward the entrance. Brian had arrived, and beside him stood Sarah. The room reacted instantly, not dramatically, subtly, whispers, glances, phones lifting discreetly. Sarah almost turned around the moment she noticed how people stared. Brian leaned slightly toward her. "You okay? I suddenly remember why I hate rich people. That's healthy." Despite her nerves, she laughed softly. Sarah wore a dark emerald dress flowing gently around her pregnancy curve while her hair rested naturally over one shoulder. She looked elegant without trying too hard, and painfully human inside a room full of performance. The moment Michael saw her, his chest tightened sharply. Because for the first time in weeks, she looked emotionally alive again, not fully healed, but lighter. And standing beside Brian only made the contrast worse. Brian noticed Michael immediately too. But unlike Michael, he didn't react emotionally. That calmness irritated Michael every single time. The blonde investor woman glanced between them carefully. "Well," she murmured, "this should be interesting." Michael walked away from her without answering. Meanwhile, Sarah already regretted attending. Every conversation felt loaded with curiosity pretending to be politeness. "How are you feeling? Pregnancy looks beautiful on you. Rough few weeks, huh?" Translation: Tell us the gossip. At one point, Sarah quietly stepped toward a quieter hallway needing air. The pressure in the ballroom suddenly felt exhausting. Brian followed moments later. "You disappearing? I'm considering faking labor. That would definitely clear the room." Sarah leaned against the wall carefully while exhaling slowly. "I shouldn't have come." "Yes," Brian replied calmly. "But now I get to judge wealthy people professionally." She smiled faintly. Then footsteps interrupted them. "Michael." The tension shifted instantly. Brian straightened slightly while Sarah's expression tightened with exhaustion. Michael looked directly at her first. "You look tired. That's usually what pregnancy does." The sharpness in her tone landed immediately. Michael swallowed quietly. "I just wanted to make sure you're okay." Before Sarah could answer, voices suddenly rose inside the ballroom nearby. People gathered around large screens displaying financial projections connected to the gala presentation. Then everything changed. A breaking business report flashed across the screens. Michael's company stock had dropped again. Large investors publicly pulled support. Several confidential restructuring discussions leaked online. The room exploded into whispers instantly. Michael froze. The blonde investor woman looked horrified, then angry. "You told me this information was contained." Michael turned toward her slowly. "You leaked it?" Her silence answered enough. And suddenly, everything made sense. The pressure, the manipulation, the emotional distancing. She protected herself before protecting him, just like everybody else in those circles always did. Around them, cameras appeared instantly while reporters rushed toward the unfolding situation. Questions fired everywhere. "Michael, is your company collapsing? Did personal scandals affect negotiations? Are investors abandoning leadership?" Then one reporter looked directly toward Sarah. "Did Michael's abandonment contribute to the instability?" Brian stepped between them immediately. "No questions." Another reporter pushed harder. "Sarah, were you left during a high-risk pregnancy?" Brian's expression hardened instantly. "She's not part of your entertainment." But the damage already spread through the room. Michael stood frozen while whispers moved around him from every direction. And finally, after months of pressure, ego, guilt, fear, and emotional exhaustion, he broke. Not violently, not loudly, humanly. Michael looked directly toward the reporters first, then toward Sarah. His eyes filled before he could stop it, and quietly, painfully, he admitted the truth. "I failed her." The room went silent. Completely silent. Even Sarah looked stunned. Michael shook his head slowly like he hated himself for finally saying it out loud. I cared more about control than the people I loved. His voice cracked slightly. And she paid for it. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Because suddenly this no longer felt like gossip. It felt real. Michael looked towards Sarah again. Not asking forgiveness. Not defending himself. Just broken. I failed my wife, he whispered again. Sarah's eyes filled immediately despite everything. Because pain looked different once pride finally disappeared from it. A few minutes later, Michael walked out of the ballroom alone while cameras flashed behind him relentlessly. No investors followed. No executives stopped him. Nobody. Inside the parking garage afterward, Michael finally sat inside his car gripping the steering wheel while years of emotional pressure collapsed all at once. And for the first time since becoming successful, Michael cried without trying to stop himself. Not for his company, not for his reputation, for Sarah, for the family he destroyed while trying to become powerful enough to protect it. Back upstairs, Sarah stood quietly near the ballroom windows while Brian remained beside her. You okay? He asked softly. Sarah stared out at the Washington skyline silently for several seconds, then finally whispered, I don't know if redemption is supposed to hurt this much. The call came at 3:17 in the morning. Brian woke instantly the second his phone vibrated across the nightstand. At first he thought it was work. Then he saw Sarah's name. His chest tightened immediately. Sarah. Her breathing sounded uneven. Brian. Something in her voice made him sit upright instantly. What's wrong? I think it's time. For one terrifying second his mind completely blanked. Then panic slammed into him all at once. Are you alone? My mother's asleep upstairs. Another sharp breath escaped her. Brian already stood pulling clothes on while grabbing his keys. I'm coming right now. Don't move. Sarah laughed weakly through pain. That feels medically impossible right now. Even frightened, Brian smiled briefly. Stay on the phone with me. Outside, Washington streets looked nearly empty beneath cold early morning fog while Brian drove faster than he probably should have. His hands tightened around the steering wheel the entire way. Not fear for himself, fear for her, because the hospital scare months earlier never fully left him emotionally. Every complication terrified him now, too. When he finally pulled outside the townhouse, Sarah already stood near the doorway gripping the railing tightly while her mother hurried beside her carrying bags. The moment Brian stepped out of the SUV, another contraction hit Sarah hard enough to stop her completely. Oh God, Brian reached her immediately. I've got you. Her fingers clutched his arm painfully while she fought to breathe through the pain. And honestly, seeing her like that scared him more than he expected. Sarah had spent months trying to stay emotionally strong through everything. Watching her finally look vulnerable broke something inside him quietly. Her mother opened the back door quickly. Hospital. Now. Brian nodded immediately while helping Sarah carefully into the passenger seat. The drive downtown felt endless. Streetlights blurred across wet roads while Sarah's breathing filled the SUV between contractions. Brian kept glancing toward her every few seconds. You okay? No, she breathed honestly. Another contraction hit. Sarah squeezed the seat so tightly her knuckles turned pale. Brian reached over instinctively, and without hesitation, she grabbed his hand. Hard. Sorry, she gasped painfully. Don't apologize. The fear inside the vehicle felt painfully real now. Not cinematic. Human. At one red light, Sarah suddenly looked toward him with tears in her eyes. What if something goes wrong? Brian's chest tightened sharply. Nothing prepared him for hearing fear in her voice like that. He squeezed her hand carefully. Nothing's happening to you. You don't know that. No, he admitted softly. But I know you're not doing this alone. That nearly made her cry harder. Because Michael used to say things like that once, before pressure replaced tenderness. Meanwhile, across the city, Michael slept for the first time in days when his phone began vibrating repeatedly against the dresser. He reached for it half awake. Sarah's mother. His stomach dropped immediately. Hello? You need to get to the hospital. Michael sat upright instantly. What happened? She's in labor. The room became completely still. For one brief second, Michael couldn't breathe properly. Then reality crashed into him. She okay? She's struggling. That was all he needed to hear. Within minutes, Michael rushed through his penthouse, throwing clothes on carelessly, while panic finally shattered the controlled version of himself he spent years building. At the hospital, nurses quickly moved Sarah into labor and delivery, while monitors beeped steadily around her. Everything felt overwhelming. Bright lights, paperwork, pain, voices. Brian remained beside her through all of it, not because anybody asked him to, because leaving never crossed his mind. At one point, Sarah squeezed his hand during another contraction so hard he almost laughed. "You're breaking my fingers." "Then stop talking. That's fair." Even through pain, she smiled briefly. And somehow that small moment made the fear feel less suffocating. Hours passed slowly afterward. Labor exhaustion drained color from Sarah's face while doctors monitored her carefully because of previous pregnancy complications. "We need to keep her blood pressure stable," one doctor warned quietly. Brian nodded immediately. Every sentence mentioning complications tightened something inside his chest. Around sunrise, Sarah finally drifted into exhausted silence between contractions, while Brian sat beside the bed holding a paper cup of untouched coffee. That was when Michael arrived. The second he entered the room, everything shifted emotionally again. Michael looked terrible. Wrinkled clothes, red eyes, no polished image left anywhere. Just fear, real fear. His eyes moved immediately towards Sarah lying exhausted in bed, then toward Brian beside her. For a moment nobody spoke. Then Sarah looked up weakly. "You came." Michael swallowed hard. "Of course I came." The pain in his voice surprised her slightly, because for the first time in months, he sounded emotionally honest. Michael slowly moved closer toward the bed. "I should have been here the whole time." Sarah looked down quietly. Neither of them knew what to do with the truth anymore. Brian stood carefully after a moment. "I'm going to give you both a minute." But before he could move away fully, Sarah grabbed his wrist instinctively. Not dramatically. Reflexively. Like safety. The room became still instantly. Michael saw it. And honestly, that hurt worse than any argument they ever had. Because Sarah trusted Brian naturally now. Without thinking. Without effort. Brian looked between them carefully, then quietly sat back down instead of leaving. Not possessive. Respectful. But present. Michael lowered his eyes briefly, and for the first time he fully understood what emotional absence costs a person. Another contraction suddenly hit Sarah harder than before. She cried out sharply while gripping the bed rail. Both men moved immediately. Michael froze halfway beside the bed, looking helpless, while Brian held her hand firmly. "Breathe," Brian said softly. "Look at me," Sarah tried. God, she tried, but fear overwhelmed everything now. What if she's not okay? Sarah whispered through tears. Brian leaned closer instantly. "She's okay. You don't know that. I know she's strong because you are—" Michael looked away sharply after hearing that. Because once upon a time, Sarah used to look at him for comfort exactly like this. Now another man knew how to calm her fears better than he did, and standing there inside that hospital room while morning sunlight slowly touched the endows, Michael realized something devastating. Love was never supposed to feel this lonely. By mid-morning, exhaustion had taken over the entire room. Sarah looked drained in a way that frightened both men differently. Her curls stuck slightly against her forehead from sweat, while another contraction tore through her body hard enough to make her grip the bed rail with shaking hands. The doctor checked monitors carefully. "She's progressing," she said calmly, "but labor's taking a lot out of her." That worried Brian immediately. Michael noticed it too. Every slight change in Sarah's breathing now felt terrifying. And honestly, neither man looked powerful anymore. Not the billionaire, not the CEO. Just two frightened men standing beside a woman carrying pain neither of them could fix for her. Another contraction hit harder. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut instantly. "Oh God!" Brian reached for her hand automatically. "Breathe." She tried following his voice through the pain while Michael stood helplessly near the foot of the bed. That helplessness destroyed him slowly. Because Michael built his entire life around solving problems, controlling outcomes, managing pressure. But none of that mattered here. Sarah needed comfort, safety, presence, and another man naturally became that person while Michael stood there realizing too late how badly he failed her emotionally. At one point the doctor quietly asked Sarah, "Who do you want near you while we continue?" The question shifted the room instantly. Sarah looked between both men through exhausted eyes. Michael's chest tightened painfully. Brian stayed calm. No pressure, no expectation. That restraint mattered. Finally, Sarah whispered weakly, "Both." The tension inside Michael eased slightly after hearing it. Not because he believed everything was fixed, because despite everything, Sarah still allowed him near her during the hardest moment of her life. Hours passed slowly after that. Outside, Washington moved through another ordinary afternoon, while inside the hospital room time felt completely separate from the rest of the world. Sarah drifted between pain, exhaustion, fear, and emotional numbness. At one point, she suddenly looked toward Michael during a quiet moment between contractions. "You really scared me." The softness in her voice somehow hurt worse than anger. Michael moved closer carefully. "I know. I thought—" Her breathing shook slightly. "I thought you stopped loving me." Michael closed his eyes briefly. Because that sentence exposed the real damage underneath everything else. Not the scandal, not the abandonment. The emotional loneliness. When he looked back at her, his voice sounded raw for the first time in years. "I never stopped loving you." Sarah's eyes filled immediately. "Then why did it feel like I was begging to be loved?" Silence swallowed the room. Michael looked down toward his hands briefly before answering. "Because I let fear turn me into somebody selfish. No excuses, no investor explanations, no polished defense, just truth." Brian quietly looked away slightly after hearing that. Not because he disagreed, because some emotional moments belonged only to them. Sarah stared at Michael carefully like she was trying to separate the man she married from the man who abandoned her. "Every time I needed you," she whispered painfully, "you disappeared." Michael's eyes filled instantly. "I know. And every time I tried fixing us, you made me feel like I was asking for too much." His breathing became uneven. "I know." The honesty in his voice changed something inside the room. Not reconciliation, but honesty finally replaced performance. And honestly, that mattered. Another contraction slammed into Sarah suddenly before either of them could continue. She cried out sharply while gripping Brian's hand hard enough to make him wince. "That's definitely broken," he muttered quietly. Despite the pain, Sarah almost laughed. Michael stared at the interaction silently, and strangely, jealousy no longer dominated the feeling inside his chest. Grief did. Because Brian wasn't replacing him through manipulation. Brian simply stayed. That realization hurt differently. As labor intensified, fear returned stronger. The doctor's expression became more serious while checking monitors. "We need one more strong push." Sarah shook her head immediately, through tears. "I can't." "Yes, you can," Brian said firmly but gently. "I'm tired." Michael stepped closer then, and for the first time in months his voice sounded like the man Sarah fell in love with years earlier. "Baby," he whispered painfully. "Look at me." Sarah lifted tear-filled eyes toward him weakly. "You are the strongest person I know." The room became still after he said it, because that sentence sounded real, not strategic, not rehearsed, real. Michael's hand carefully brushed against her forehead while emotion cracked through his voice completely. "I'm so sorry I made you feel alone." Sarah started crying harder instantly, not because the pain stopped, because the apology finally sounded honest. And honesty changes people emotionally when they've spent too long surviving disappointment. Another contraction came, then another. The room filled with voices guiding her through the final moments while both men stayed beside her. Brian steady, Michael broken open emotionally for the first time in years. Then finally, a cry. Small, sharp, alive. Everything stopped emotionally after that sound. The doctor lifted the baby carefully while relief flooded the entire room at once. "She's healthy." Sarah covered her face instantly while sobs shook through her chest. Brian looked completely frozen. Michael looked destroyed emotionally. Not by pain, by relief. Because after months of emotional collapse, public humiliation, fear, and regret, something beautiful still survived all of it. A daughter. The doctor carefully placed the baby against Sarah's chest, and for a long moment nobody spoke. The silence felt sacred somehow. Sarah stared down at the tiny face against her skin while tears slid quietly down her cheeks. "Hi, baby." Her voice cracked completely. Brian looked away briefly, overwhelmed by emotion he clearly wasn't prepared for. Michael stood motionless beside the bed, staring at both of them, and suddenly none of the business pressure mattered anymore. Not the company, not the investors, not the money. Because standing inside that hospital room, Michael finally understood something success never taught him. People do not feel loved because you provide perfectly. They feel loved because you stay. A few minutes later, after nurses stepped out briefly, Michael quietly moved closer towards Sarah. His eyes remained fixed on the baby before he finally spoke. "I spent so much time trying to become powerful enough to protect everything." His voice SOK slightly. "And I destroyed the only thing that actually mattered." Sarah looked up at him slowly. Michael swallowed hard. "This is the first honest thing I've said in a long time." Tears filled his eyes again. "I failed you long before I left." The room stayed quiet. Brian remained near the windows, respectfully giving them space without fully leaving. Michael looked at Sarah carefully. "I don't expect forgiveness right now." His voice cracked again. "But you deserved better than the version of me you suffered beside." Sarah stared at him for several seconds. And honestly, for the first time since everything fell apart, she believed he finally understood the damage he caused. 6 months later, Washington looked different to Sarah. Not because the city changed, because she did. Winter had passed quietly into spring, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah no longer woke up every morning carrying emotional heaviness in her chest. Healing surprised her that way. It didn't arrive dramatically. No magical morning, no sudden freedom from pain. It arrived slowly through ordinary moments, feeding the baby at sunrise while soft music played through the kitchen, laughing unexpectedly at something stupid on television, sleeping through the night without waking up emotionally anxious. Little things. That was how people slowly came back to themselves. Most mornings now started at her mother's townhouse, though Sarah had finally begun looking at homes again nearby instead of returning downtown. She couldn't imagine living inside the condo with Michael anymore. Too many memories lived there. Too much loneliness. One Saturday morning, sunlight spilled warmly through the kitchen while the baby sat bundled against Sarah's chest, making tiny frustrated noises because her bottle took too long. "Your patience is terrible, already," Sarah whispered gently. The baby frowned dramatically. Sarah laughed softly. Then the front door opened. "Brian, right on schedule." Again. He stepped inside carrying coffee trays and grocery bags while still wearing gym clothes beneath his coat. "You know," Sarah said, "normal people sleep on Saturdays." Brian looked offended immediately. "I bring caffeine and emotional support. Respect my sacrifice. You also criticize my music choices. Because sad 90s R&B at 8 in the morning feels aggressive." The baby suddenly kicked her legs excitedly after hearing Brian's voice. Brian stopped mid-step. "There she goes." Sarah smiled quietly, watching the reaction. That still affected her emotionally sometimes. The baby recognized him now, reached for him naturally, trusted him instinctively, and honestly, Brian never once treated that trust carelessly. He set the groceries down before walking over carefully. "Good morning, tiny dictator." The baby immediately grabbed his finger. Sarah watched them silently for a moment. Peace. That was the word she kept returning to lately. Not excitement, not obsession. Peace. Brian sat beside her on the couch while gently adjusting the blanket around the baby. "You sleep at all last night?" "Barely. You say that every morning." "Because she believes bedtime is oppression." Brian laughed softly, then naturally took the baby into his arms when Sarah reached for her coffee. The movement felt familiar now, comfortable, like they had quietly built rhythms together without forcing anything. That mattered to Sarah more than dramatic romance ever could. Meanwhile, Michael changed too, not quickly, not perfectly, but honestly. After the birth, he stepped away from several leadership positions inside the company while restructuring continued publicly. Washington business circles still discussed his collapse occasionally, but Michael no longer chased public approval the way he once did. That version of him exhausted him now. Instead, he started therapy quietly, spent more time away from corporate events, learned how to exist without constantly performing success. Some days remained brutal emotionally, especially when he saw Sarah and the baby together, especially when Brian stood beside them naturally. But for the first time in his adult life, Michael stopped trying to control outcomes emotionally. That was new for him. One afternoon he visited Sarah at the townhouse carrying diapers and formula after asking permission first. Small change, but important. The old Michael would have simply arrived expecting access. Now he knocked carefully. Sarah opened the door holding the baby against her shoulder. Michael smiled softly the moment he saw them. "There's my girl." The baby reached toward him immediately. Something emotional crossed Sarah's face seeing it, because despite everything, Michael genuinely loved his daughter. And over time, Sarah learned something difficult but important. A person could fail you deeply and still love you honestly. Those truths sometimes existed together painfully. Michael sat quietly in the living room later, holding the baby carefully, while Sarah folded laundry nearby. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "You seem lighter now." Sarah looked up briefly. "I think I stopped fighting reality." Michael nodded slowly like he understood exactly what she meant. A few seconds later, Brian arrived carrying takeout containers. The room shifted slightly. Not tense anymore, just complicated. Brian paused briefly after noticing Michael already there. Michael stood calmly. "I was leaving." Brian nodded respectfully. No hostility. That surprised Sarah every time now. The rivalry between them had changed after the birth. Not friendship, but understanding. Because both men finally saw each other clearly. Michael looked toward Brian before leaving. "Thanks. For staying with her through everything." Brian looked almost uncomfortable receiving the gratitude. She deserved support. Michael swallowed quietly. Yeah, a faint sad smile crossed his face. She did. After he left, silence settled softly inside the townhouse. Brian placed the takeout bags onto the kitchen counter. "How'd that go?" Sarah thought about it carefully. Sad. Brian nodded slightly, because some endings carried grief even when they were necessary. That night after dinner, Sarah stepped onto the small front porch while the baby slept inside against Brian's chest. The spring sunset painted warm orange light across southeast D.C., while distant music drifted softly from somewhere down the block. Neighbors talked loudly outside. Cars passed slowly. Life continued. Brian walked onto the porch a few minutes later holding the sleeping baby carefully against him, and suddenly Sarah realized something that almost made her emotional. Nobody was performing anymore. Not her, not Brian, not even Michael. The chaos finally ended. Brian sat beside her quietly while the baby slept peacefully in his arms. Sarah watched them together for a long moment before speaking softly. "You know what's strange?" Brian glanced toward her. "What?" "I spent years thinking love meant constantly proving yourself worthy." Brian stayed quiet, listening. Sarah looked out toward the sunset again. "But real love feels calmer than that." The honesty in her voice settled deeply between them. Brian looked down at the baby sleeping against his chest before answering carefully. "I think real love feels safe." Sarah's eyes filled slightly after hearing that, because after everything, that was exactly the word she had been searching for. Safe, not perfect, not flashy, safe. Slowly, Sarah rested her head against Brian's shoulder while the city glowed softly beneath the evening sky. No cameras, no investors, no performance, just peace. And somewhere behind them inside the quiet townhouse, the life Sarah once begged to protect had finally become the life she no longer needed to beg for. Because in the end, love was never about who said the right words. Love was who stayed. And as the Washington sunset stretched warmly across the porch, Brian gently rocked the eeping baby in his arms while Sarah watched them quietly beside him. Peace, safety, healing.